Liverpool was the most bombed city in England outside of London during World War II. Huge areas of the city were reduced to rubble by German bombs. Most of the bombs fell in the area around the docks, just over a mile from where my family lived in Eldon Street, in the inner city. That was where I was born, 3 years after the war ended. I still remember the rubble from bombed-out streets that took years to clear. I was the 8th of 10 children. We lost baby Marie when she was just 8 months old. The 4 girls slept in the same bed in one of the 2 bedrooms. The 4 boys slept in the living room, and Mum and Dad had the other bedroom. I have a dim memory of a toy pram. It was placed under the dining table where I found it on Christmas morning. My mum was excited when she won it for me in a competition. I remember dragging that pram up 2 flights of stairs from our ground floor tenement to my friend's house. My dad's work at the local gasworks in Athol Street was considered essential service for the war effort, so he never served in the armed forces. After the war, he kept working there as a fireman, shoveling coal into the furnaces. He would walk home from work, his clothes smelling of gas and coal. Liverpool needed more houses to replace those lost in the war. They tore up a lot of the inner city to rebuild it, and in the meantime, people had to have somewhere to live. So the city built rental housing estates on the outskirts of Liverpool. They were known as Liverpool Overspill. The first one was built in Kirby, 8 miles to the northeast from where we lived. We moved there when I was 5. Kirby had distinct neighbourhoods: Southdean, Westvale, Northwood and later Tower Hill. Parts of Kirby had problems in the early years. People loved having better houses, but half of the population were young children or teenagers. There was a lot of unemployment and there were few amenities for kids. By 1953, there were 1,000 houses on the Kirby estate. Youth with nothing to do would wander across the estate, and vandalism became a big issue for Kirby and attracted a lot of negative press. It took years for Kirby to settle down and develop its own community spirit. We had a black and white TV at home. As a young child, I would watch my favorite programs: Andy Pandy, Bill and Ben, the Flower Pot Men, and the Wooden Tops, my favorite. One badly damaged photograph is all I have to remind me of happy times when we had a holiday in Rhyl in North Wales.
Not far from Eldon Street, where Cathy was born, was Mill Road Hospital. In the 1800s, it was a workhouse for the poor and sick, but by the mid-1900s, it had become an important maternity hospital. On one terrible night in May 1941, it suffered a direct hit from a German bomb, and more than 80 mothers, newborn babies, and hospital staff were killed. The hospital was reopened, and 3 years after the war, I was born there, the 3rd child and first son in our family. It was just 1 month after Cathy was born in Eldon Street, 2 miles away, but it would be 18 years before we would meet. My dad was a professional soldier, and our home was in one of the married quarters at Camp Hill, an army camp right next to Walton Woods in the south of Liverpool, 7 miles from the city centre. At 6 weeks old, I was christened at the local Methodist church, St. James in Walton, by the Reverend Robert Collins, who was soon to play an important part in our lives. My dad had been home from the war for about 4 years and was still in the army when he was killed in a road accident coming back from a training exercise in Wales. His loss was devastating to my grief-stricken mother. She now had a 9-month-old baby, me, and 2 daughters aged 10 and 8 to look after on her own. She was no longer entitled to army housing. She would have to move from the camp and find means to support the family. I was too young to remember any of this, but my 2 elder sisters, now in their 80s, remember that difficult time.
I can remember the day of Dad's funeral, but we didn't realise it was the funeral, did we?
No,
We
no,
went. The minister was Mr. Collins, and his wife had a young baby because she had a pram, and she took us out. And I remember walking. I can't remember where we walked, but we went for a walk, and it was only when we went back home that we realised that it had been the day of the funeral.
Yeah, Mr. Collins was the man who told me that Dad had been killed.
He sat with
He was-
either of
yes,
us,
he
one
was-
either side of
he was
him.
a
with his
nice
arm.
guy.
It took a while for the penny to drop.
Hmm.
What he was actually telling us, you know. And I can remember the policeman coming to the door when Dad died. I remember Mum saying she was distraught, you know, and I remember her telling me that one night they had fires in the bedrooms then, and she just didn't want to live after Dad died. And she had these tablets, the doctor had given her sleeping tablets. And she looked at the box and she thought, I'm just going to take the lot. I just want to be with them. You cried. You were in the car, cried, and she just picked them up and threw them all in the fire.
She must have been really strong, because I know the relatives in the northeast wanted her to go and live up there, but she said, no, I don't want to leave. Probably because the grave's here, you see.
Yeah. And I said, does this mean we have to stay in Liverpool? And she said, your daddy's here and that's where we're going to stay. Yeah.
When I was 5 years old, I fell over in the school playground. We just moved to Kirby, and I cut my knee. My knee got infected, and it infected my bone, and I ended up with osteomyelitis. And I was sent to this hospital, this land where Alder Hey Hospital used to be. It's no longer there, and I'm saddened by that, because I spent 4 years of my childhood in this hospital, so it's sort of a home to me. Sometimes the hospital nurses would join with parents to take us out to the Empire Theatre in Liverpool to see a pantomime. One day, the famous American singing cowboy, Roy Rogers, came to the hospital with his horse to visit the children. But there were also times I would cry when my mum would come to visit me, and I'd want to go home with her. Now when I think of it, it was a dear place that took care of me and my leg. And my mum was told at one time that I could have quite easily lose my leg, but thankfully the doctors were able to save it. Alder Hey Hospital, as I knew it, was demolished in 2014 and was rebuilt right next to where the old one was. It's now one of the largest children's hospitals in the UK. There was also another time I remember my dad came to visit me with my brother Terry, and I had a doll and the arm had broken off, and I remember them fixing it for me while they visited with me. And so that's a nice memory that I have of my dad coming to visit me also. But it was always my mum, faithful mum. She used to have to get 3 different buses to travel from Kirby to the hospital here. When I finally came out of hospital, I spent about a year in an open-air school for convalescent kids. Next was junior school. Because our family was Catholic, I went to St. Joseph's. I can't remember ever doing anything bad as a child, but in 2009, 3 of my sisters, Anne, Linda, and Tina, sat down in Hawaii for a chat with one of my daughters and recalled an incident I had forgotten.
One particular warm moment is that I can remember us sitting under the table in the kitchen. We used to have a tablecloth that come right down, and it got very warm underneath there because we were smoking rolled up newspaper.
We moved from army housing to the prefab estate in the nearby suburb of Belvale, about 6 miles from Liverpool city centre, but only a mile or 2 from Woolton. Built as part of Liverpool's recovery after the war, this huge housing estate consisted of nearly 1,200 units. Each could be erected in a couple of weeks. Growing up in the prefab estate holds a lot of happy memories for me.
But when we went to the prefabs, we were thrilled to bits, weren't we? Because we had a fridge.
Yeah, at the fridge.
We had
I remember
a
that.
sort of washing machine, which was like a boiler.
A little garden.
Yeah, and it was lovely. It was a lovely little place. Really loved it.
Well, the thing is, the neighbours were lovely.
Yes.
Everybody knew everybody else.
Yes.
Because I was so young when my dad died, I grew up with no personal memory of him. Maybe because of that, as a child, I never felt the loss of a father as keenly as my sisters and mother. We never went hungry, but there were few luxuries. No phone, no TV until much later, certainly no car. A half shoulder of lamb once a week, a chicken only at Christmas. We didn't have a camera either. These photos were probably taken by my grandpa on a rare visit from another part of the country. I remember once seeing my mother cut the dandelions from the back lawn with a pair of scissors before we got shears and eventually a push lawnmower. Indoors, BBC Radio was our entertainment. There was a program for the under fives called Listen with Mother, and Mum would sit down with me every day just before 2 o'clock. It always began the same way, with that formal BBC voice.
Good afternoon. I'm going to tell you a story called Big Fat Pusscat. Are you sitting comfortably? Then I'll begin.
If Anne was in earshot, as soon as she heard, "Are you sitting comfortably?" she liked to shout no. Mum would tell her to stop spoiling it for me. Anne would join me, however, for a favourite program, Journey into Space. It was still well before Russia was to launch Sputnik 1 in 1957.
Journey into space. Jet Morgan in Operation Luna.
It was close to my bedtime, so I would usually ask for a bowl of cereal and then make it last until the end of the program. Mum would usually turn a blind eye. Ruth looked after me when I was little, and Anne soon became a kind of cross between big sister and surrogate father. She took an interest in everything I did, encouraged me in hobbies and activities. I would wait for her at the bus stop coming home from work to tell her about my day. My first reading materials were the Beano and Dandy comics. Started in the 1930s and still going nearly 90 years later with many of the same iconic characters. Dennis the Menace, the Bash Street Kids. I loved these characters. A figurine of one of them, Smithy, who always did things wrong, was a favorite of Anne and me. A figurine of Smithy graces one of the bookshelves in our home today. When I was a little older, Mum would come home from work every Tuesday evening and hand me 2 more serious comics, The Lion and the Tiger, which I would read avidly. Perhaps as a result, when I attended Joseph Williams Primary School on the prefab estate, I was always confident when asked to read aloud in class. Sometimes Anne would borrow books from her work at Wilson's bookshop for me to read. She gave me my first book on astronomy. From 1948 until 1960, my mother made small, periodic deposits in the post office savings book in my name. We never had much money. As a widow, Mum worked out of necessity most of her life. Yet she budgeted very wisely, shopped carefully, and managed to make a happy, comfortable home for us. When I think of her scraping enough to make these small deposits year after year, of her scrupulous honesty and hard work, I wish I could tell her now of the gratitude I feel. The values I learned in those years, hard work, responsibility, and integrity, came mostly from my mother's example. I enjoyed my time at Joseph Williams. There were large classes, over 40 students, which was considered to be overcrowding, but it was the only school on the prefab estate. My fondest memories are from the ages of 10 and 11. A new teacher came to the school. Tall, black-rimmed glasses, dark hair parted in the middle. He was an excellent teacher, but I remember him most for starting up the school football team. In this working-class community, we couldn't afford a proper leather football. Mr. Herbert was struck by the skill of the boys as he watched them play football in the playground with a tennis ball at our feet. As a result, our school team was created in 1959. In our first year, we reached the semi-finals of the Liverpool Schools competition. At age 11, our final year, we entered 2 simultaneous competitions and won the cups for both, the first time that had been done in Liverpool school history. It was a wonderful time for the boys, life-changing in what it taught us about teamwork, effort, and sacrifice. My sister Anne, always supportive, followed up progress, kept statistics. In that last year, the team scored 98 goals and conceded only 9. Over 60 years later, I can still remember the names of every one of those boys. Back row, left to right: Raymond Cook, Alan Jones, Thomas Quayle, George Ellis, Robert Kirkwood, me, reserve Terence McNerney, Mr. Herbert, John McCubbin, Stephen Caulfield, Kevin Wilson, Brian Corson, and Keith Cooley. That same year, Ruth married Gordon Roberts, and I gained a brother-in-law. Almost as important to me, I was now out of short pants for the first time.
Nearly 50 years after I attended Cherryfield Primary School, I went back there in 2006 for a nostalgic look. I was just in time. 3 years after that, the school was demolished. I've been back to Kirby many times since to visit family, even though we no longer live in England. In 2024, I paid another visit to the places that were familiar to me growing up as a teenager. In the 1950s and 60s, we lived in Cawthorne Avenue in South Dean, number 19. We were the first family in that house. It looks different now and has been well kept. This is the doctor's surgery where our family doctor referred me to the hospital after I cut my leg. As a teenager, I would go to Broad Lane for shopping for my mum. Kids would hang around the fish and chip shop and the sweet shop, which is still there. I've just come in to look because I used to come and buy sweets when I was a little girl, like that. Yeah, but they had the counter coming this way and that way, and they had all these jars of sweets.
Yes,
And I used to love, yeah. Yes, I remember when I went right around like this. And Doris, thanks. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks. Before I reached my teens, my dad fell ill with lung cancer. Like most working-class men back then, he'd smoked for years. On top of that, he inhaled coal and gas fumes working at the gasworks. His bed was brought downstairs so he could be close to the family in his final days. On September 26, 1961, my older brother Terry collected me and my younger sisters, Linda and Tina, from school to tell us gently that our dad had died. It was Tina's 5th birthday. I was just 13. Soon I grew out of the games we had played as children in the street. Hopscotch, skipping to a large rope stretched across the road, or even catch the boy, kiss the boy. I went to St. Gregory's Catholic School for Girls, where the headmistress was a nun. I remember Sister Monica's strictness in making sure the girls' skirts were the proper length. Her method was to have the girls kneel on the floor, and if the skirt didn't touch the floor, it was too short. I left school in the summer of my 16th birthday to work at the chemist in Broad Lane. My mum wanted me to stay on at school, but my closest friend, Dorothy Sweeney, left to be a hairdresser, and the attraction of a weekly wage was appealing at that time. Then, when I was 16, something happened which was to change the course of my life.
In my final year at Joseph Williams School at age 11, I took the required exam and the results were good enough to get me into the Holt, my first choice of high school 2 miles away. We stayed in the prefab estate all through my high school years, and for the first few years I caught the 79 bus to school. My memories of high school are indifferent. I had friends, of course, but the one good friend who influenced me most was Jeff Phimister. Jeff and I became friends around the age of 12, and we are still in touch more than 60 years later. He lived at the south end of the same prefab estate. He was one of the more mature kids in our year, intelligent, articulate, had a better vocabulary than I did, and we shared interests. From him I picked up an interest in politics. We attended the pre-election rally in St. George's Hall in Liverpool in October 1964, when Harold Wilson became Prime Minister. That growing interest in current affairs and modern history was probably instrumental in my decision later to become a journalist. From me, Jeff picked up an interest in astronomy, and we sometimes attended the Liverpool Astronomical Society together. As a teenager, I would often walk to his house on a Sunday evening to play chess with his dad. Once, Jeff and I packed a lunch and decided to track the local River Alt, nothing more than a stream, really, to its outlet in the River Mersey. I had an impressive bird's egg collection, mostly acquired from other kids. It still exists intact 60 years later. And then there was the cigarette packet collection phase. Jeff Phimister and I would walk all over Liverpool city centre, looking in every waste paper bin for discarded packets. Once again, my sister Anne not only lent support by smoking every exotic brand of cigarettes we could find, but enlisted the girls at her place of work, Wilson's bookstore in Renshaw Street, to look in every bin they passed in the street. As a result, I amassed a spectacular collection of more than 1,000 packets from all over the world.
Yes, oh, you had a fabulous collection. In those days, everybody smoked. You see, it was popular, wasn't it? The worst ones I ever smoked, because I did smoke in those days, Spanish Shawl, they were scented. Oh.
I had a passion for astronomy since I was quite small. Around the age of 16, I built my own reflecting telescope. Since my sister Ruth now had a garage, I used it to try, ambitiously, to grind my own parabolic mirror with carborundum powder. It didn't work, but Anne came to the rescue and gave me the £10 to buy the crucial 6-inch mirror, a significant sum in the early 60s. I would spend hours, often all night, during the holidays with my telescope in our prefab garden, sketching planets, searching for double stars, and looking at mountains on the moon. And I would keep meticulous notes of what I found by shining a dim red light in the dark, and then complete my sketches in daylight the next day. Seeing the polar caps on Mars, tracking the moons of Jupiter over the course of a night, sketching the rings of Saturn or finding Neptune invisible to the naked eye was exhilarating. Back on Earth, my whole world opened up on my 16th birthday when Ruth and her husband Gordon bought me a brand new racing bike. I rode everywhere. Anne and I, Anne on an old bike given to the family, would ride to the edge of the housing estate where there were no streetlights to stargaze. Later, I rode with a friend to see the radio telescope at Jodrell Bank in Cheshire, then on my own to Lake Bala in Wales, a round trip of 140 miles. It was not until many years later that I realized that my bike ride to Bala had taken me along the same Welsh road where my dad had been killed in 1949. Back then, the focus of the British education system was the General Certificate of Education, taken at the age of 16. Passes in 5 or 6 subjects usually meant a good job on leaving school. There was an option to take 2 more years with advanced exams at 18. I'd started my advanced level studies at school after getting good results in the GCE. By now, I was thinking about what I would do for a living, and I settled on journalism for a profession. But most newspapers wanted to take on trainee reporters straight from high school rather than university graduates. So when my brother-in-law showed me an ad for a junior reporter at the Merseyside Weekly News Group, I wrote for an interview. I received a generous reference from the Holt headmaster after he lectured me that I should stay on for university. He wasn't a fan of journalists. My interview went well, and editor Ron Carrington said he would let me know. I knew there had been dozens of applicants. I thanked him, was halfway down the stairs heading for the exit, when I remembered I hadn't shown him my headmaster's reference. I hesitated for a moment, then decided to return to his office and show it to him. "I'm glad you came back," he said. He read the reference and said, "That's a good one," and asked me if I could start the following Monday. I was elated. I was 17 and had my first job.
Lots of things were about to change in my life. My Uncle Freddie, my mum's brother and his wife and 2 children came to stay with us from Belgium. When they went to visit my cousin Cathy Waitman's family on the other side of Liverpool, I went with them. After that, Cathy and I renewed our old friendship. Upstairs in their home in the suburb of Chilwell were 2 young men staying as lodgers. They were Americans serving as missionaries for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Back then, they were usually referred to as Mormons. Cathy and I both became interested in what they had to say. I was a Catholic, Cathy was a Protestant. The missionaries had no church building of their own back then, and they would meet on Sundays at a social hall in Penny Lane. I would stay at Cathy's every weekend, so I could go to church with her. First, I would go to early Mass at a nearby Catholic church, then run all the way back to Cathy's, where the missionaries would pick us up and take us to their meeting. Cathy joined the church in 1965. I wanted to, but my Catholic mum, understandably, objected at first. Perhaps because of our experience with these visiting Americans, Cathy and I wanted to go to the United States as nannies for a working holiday. Cathy went first, and I was to follow a couple of months later. I was baptized into the church in Liverpool 3 days after my 18th birthday. By now, the church had built a lovely chapel just off Queen's Drive in Millbank, Liverpool. On one evening, not long after Cathy Waitman left for America, I was serving on the tables at a church social event in the cultural hall. I didn't know it, but that evening I would meet my future husband.
I remember there was a dinner one evening and I was serving on the tables with some other young women, and Ruth was attending that dinner, but Gordon was working a night shift, so he couldn't come with her. So Ruth brought you as her companion. And when I was serving on that table, your table, Ruth said, "Oh, Cathy, this is my brother Mike," and this tall figure stood up and we shook hands and we said hi, and that was it for the evening pretty much.
Yeah, I don't remember anything about the meal, but I do remember the waitress.
Very shortly after that brief introductory meeting with Mike, I flew to San Francisco to start my work as a nanny. Cathy Waitman met me at the airport. She was working with a family in Moraga, 30 minutes outside of Oakland. The family was Howard and Kay Ruff. They were a lovely family, members of our church. They called their house the Ruff House. I stayed the weekend with Cathy, and then they put me on a bus to San Jose, where I met the family I was to work for. Unfortunately, things didn't work out too well in San Jose, and after Cathy returned to England, I took over her job with the Ruffs in Moraga. Howard was an investment advisor and operated a speed reading school in Oakland. I went to the office with him occasionally to help his staff with clerical work, but most of the time I stayed at home in their large one-level house, complete with swimming pool, and looked after the children. Sometimes, when on my own in the house, I would put on the songs from The Sound of Music and dance to I Am 16, Going on 17. I got to visit Disneyland and Salt Lake City, and also had a few piano lessons which, unfortunately, I didn't keep up when I returned home just before my 19th birthday. But I remained friends with the Ruffs, especially with one of their daughters, Debbie, for many years.
Working as a journalist was a period of rapid maturing for me. I was a year at the newspaper's head office in Widnes, and was then transferred to Liverpool, a much bigger city with much more opportunity. Our office was in Bold Street, and later we moved to better premises in the Albany building in Old Hall Street. Every week our circulation was increasing steadily, and I loved being in the thick of it, finding new stories to report on. Several of us, the reporters, would travel to Salford, near Manchester, each week for university studies in English, government and law as part of our journalism training. I was already deeply interested in politics, in which I had begun to specialize, and while I got passes in English and law, I was pleased to pick up a distinction in government. Meanwhile, the prefab estate in Belvale was gradually being demolished, and the residents were being moved to other housing estates around the city. It was a miserable time for that community. We moved to one of those new estates in Cantrell Farm, an odd name because it was nothing like a farm. Mum, Anne and I tolerated it, but we were not happy with the move. I visited the prefabs when just a few families remained to write a story for the Liverpool Weekly News about that lost community, a victim of the naive planning practices of the 1960s. The prefabs have long gone now, except for the memories of the people who lived there. They've been replaced by more permanent brick houses. Our prefab at number 4 Windhurst Road was right on this spot. Some of the names of the streets have been kept: Cloverdale Road, Elmhurst Road, although not quite in the same places. The bus stop where I used to wait to meet Anne coming home from work is still there, although the distinctive green buses that characterize Liverpool have long gone. Windhurst Road, too, has disappeared forever. Do the children who play here now have any inkling of the thriving community which once flourished here more than 60 years ago? Or the park a few yards from here where no ball games were allowed, but where we played football and cricket anyway, every evening, keeping a wary eye out for the local policeman on his bicycle. Cathy Berry had been gone for most of 1967 in California. In that year, I had begun to do some serious research about the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I approached it from the position of a skeptic. In the Liverpool Central Library, I found more than 30 books either about the church or with significant relevant passages. Most were critiques, some were harsh. As an objective non-member, I found many of the criticisms biased and unreasonable, born from the prejudices of the 19th century. Many writings were from evangelical Christians. But my reading was broad and included other books on Catholicism, history, archaeology, philosophy. The more I studied, the more open I became, especially after reading the Book of Mormon and the Bible. I came to understand that the term Mormon was never the correct name for the church. Its proper name, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, reflects its central tenet that it is a restoration of the original Church of Christ in latter times, and saints simply means members of the church. I found the idea of the restoration of the original church with its 12 apostles, lay ministry, and missionaries intriguing. I started formal discussion with the missionaries at about the time that Cathy returned from the United States. I sent her a birthday card in September of 1967. I signed it, Mike. Her reaction on reading it, I learned later, was, "Who's Mike?" Evidently, I hadn't made the same impression on her that she made on me, but we talked at church and had our first date on September 20th, 1967. I was still researching the church.
This beautiful building, it was where we had our first date on September 20th, 1967. I had an orange juice and you had
a vodka and lime.
And then we went and sat in the car park, and I liked you a lot because you talked a lot and I didn't have to say anything much. And you showed me all the constellations.
So I loved astronomy and I used to love to talk about it. And fortunately, Cathy didn't like to talk. She was shy. So I just talked. She listened. That changed a lot though when we got married. On December 15th, 1967, I was baptized by total immersion into the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. My mum came to my baptism.
When I knew you were going to join the church, I said to Mum, "How do you feel about it, Mum?" Because I said, "I know you were upset when I did." And she said, "I've seen what it's done to you and for you." And she said, "I'm happy."
Like many people in Britain at that time, her prejudices had been rooted in old wives' tales from the 19th century. Now, she gave me her blessing. I know it sometimes makes people feel uncomfortable when friends talk about religion or politics for that matter. I get that. These things are personal. But it would be impossible to tell the story of the first 20 years of our lives without this essential step that we both took before the age of 20 and which affected the rest of our lives. This wasn't just about finding a church to attend on Sundays. We knew we were making a lifetime commitment. Putting Jesus Christ at the center of our lives would shape our values, motivate our daily actions, and even guide us in raising our children. As it turned out, our decision would also take us and our future family far from where we grew up in Liverpool. We knew we would want to spend some time out of England. Cathy had already been to the United States, but I had never been out of the UK. When we learned that we could travel to Australia as immigrants for just £10 each on an assisted passage, as long as we stayed for 2 years, and I could double my salary, we saw it as a way to save money for a house and then return. We saved hard for the year we dated in Liverpool. Cathy enrolled in nursing school at Walton Hospital. And I continued to work at the Liverpool Weekly News until I gave in my notice just before we were married. My editor came to our wedding. Among the congratulatory cards we received was one signed by the various suburban residents associations all over Liverpool: Chilwell, Belvale, Daysbrook, Abercrombie, Old Swan, Wavertree, Speke. These were the people I'd got to know by reporting on the housing conditions and trials they faced in the 1960s, just like those in the prefabs.
On November 9th, 1968, we were married at the Latter-day Saint Chapel in Liverpool. Cathy Wakeman and my sister Linda were bridesmaids. Keith Cooley, Mike's next-door neighbour in the prefabs, was his best man. 1 week later, we took a train from Lime Street Station for London Euston. With 5 hours to kill before our train to Southampton, we wandered up Fleet Street, home of many British national newspapers, had breakfast in a small cafe, and then took a bus to see some relatives, my Aunt Eileen, my cousin Patsy and her husband Peter, in a London suburb. Then it was a train to Southampton docks. Walking up the gangplank to board the ocean liner Fair Star, ready to sail for Australia, we both knew we were facing an entirely unknown future, far away from the Liverpool we had both called our home.